Welcome to case study video 9, white balance blending. What I'm going to do in this video is to start demonstrating the concept of local adjustments versus global adjustments. Again, we're going to be focus stacking 3 images, one for the foreground, one for the midground, and one for infinity. But before we move them into Photoshop to do the stacking process, we're going to make some more fairly dramatic changes here in Lightroom. Okay, so let's get started. My initial chromatic and aberration sharpen, which is the first point of anything that we do. The file clearly needs leveled, even though the levelometer within the D800E was basically saying that the frame was level. And the primary thing I want to concentrate on here is the question of white balance. The as shot setting here shows a reasonably warm foreground and a reasonably cool sky. Now, I want to exaggerate that because if we look at any of the presets, so here's auto. What happens with the camera when it's looking at a scene? In terms of white balance, it's going to take an average out of the whole scene. So here the clouds are very grey, the sand was very red because it was Torrid and sandstone from the west coast of Scotland. So it was quite a dramatic shift in tones. Now, to my mind and memory, the foreground isn't as red as it was, and the sky isn't as foreboding as it was. So what I'm going to do is use the gradient filter here, the gradient tool, where we now have the capacity to change white balance, exposure, and sharpening, etc. within very specific areas using either a gradient or a brush. Now, because the foreground and the sky here are quite demarked with a fairly straight line, it's quite easy to use a gradient tool. So what I'm going to do first of all is just warm up that foreground a little touch more, would increase the exposure a third of a stop, I'm going to boost the clarity a little bit to give it a little bit of pop, maybe touch the saturation, although saturation is something I really tend to do an awful lot more in Photoshop, and maybe just boost the sharpness by a few percent as well, boost the contrast a tiny little bit, reduce the shadows, increase the highlights, and what we're doing is just adding contrast, clarity, saturation, just a bit of vibrance, to give the thing a bit of a pop. With a second gradient, I'm going to pull down from the sky and do the opposite. I'm going to cool the sky a fraction. Not dramatically, but just enough. I'm going to push the highlights up and bring the shadows down a touch. Don't need to add clarity. Contrast is a funny one. You can tend to find that you can add better contrast in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is reduce contrast in this one. Add a little bit of saturation. And if we turn off that, we can now see in the thumbnails how dramatically different this exposure is to the other two in the frame. So what we'll do is with the 3 of those selected, we can sync those settings, and we now have a much more vibrant and poppy file to work with. So as again, we are going to now move these into Photoshop, opening as layers, and we will conduct exactly the same process as we did in the previous video, where we first of all align the layers and then we use the blend to create the focus stack. Bearing in mind also that we're back in that scenario where we have moving subjects, so we need to copy that infinity layer to use that as our furthest distant layer to create the front to back sharpness without having any moving elements within the frame. So in just a moment we will have our 3 files, and once we have those we can rapidly move forward. And here we go. So first of all we need to check which one is infinity, And as in the previous example, it is the bottom exposure. So I'm going to drag that into the new layer palette. I'm going to call it Infinity and drag it to the top of the stack. And with all 4 layers selected, I am going to auto align layers on the auto setting. This is fairly quick. We turn off the top layer. We can actually hide that top layer because we don't need it right now. And with the bottom 3 layers, which is the original 3 layers, we can auto blend them in the stack mode. And this will create our photo stacked image. But of course, we'll do the usual of creating a problem zone in that middle area. So again, we have a beautiful image that's sharp from the front all the way to the back, but we have horrible problems in this transitional zone. So we turn on our top layer again, add a new mask, select the gradient with white on top and black below, and we can drag down from here, not too far, and we have our focus stacked image. At this point in time, it's very easy to just flatten the layer. And that's us. We have a single file now, and we're down to 200 megabytes, which eases things off. The thing that I want to do with this image is I want to make it 4:5. When I first saw this image, to me it looked pretty much like it was going to be a 4:5. The way this cloud defines the top of the frame, I kind of figured that everything above that point was superfluous to requirements. And at this stage, I'm going to call that the end point. This image is far from finished. I think we can move forward with this image in a later video to see exactly how I would process this to produce something that I would consider to be a final frame. So for now, that is the end of case study video 9.